Namaste and welcome everyone to this talk on riverine worship and Hinduism. So in this talk, we'll discuss the idea of sacred waters, sacred geography, and how river veneration is integral to Sanatan Dharma or Hindu Dharma. Before we go any further, please subscribe to the Atharva Forum YouTube channel. So today, we're going to discuss this topic: sacred waters, sacred geography, deification of rivers, veneration of rivers. Of late, religion, ecology, economy research is something that is catching up. There's a lot of scholarship going on where people are trying to contribute to this thought stream, which some today call spiritual ecology, which is essentially looking for how various cultures and various religions looked at ecology and environment, and then try to juxtapose that with various thought frames on economy, on ecology, on the broader pictures around developmental paradigms, so on. For example, I've read this paper recently where a particular researcher took up how a few jatis in Assam, tribal jatis, how they are connected with a particular river worship, and how all these three jatis together have their own customs and rituals and traditions around that particular river. And then they go on to iterate about how reverence of nature is integral to various indigenous jatis, to various tribals, so on. And what they do here, typically in this research, is to say that these jatis, they are indigenous, they are something else. And then you have the Western paradigm, and there's a vacuum between. So what these researchers do essentially is to say that today what dominates our psyche is a Western developmental model. And then you have all these forest tribes and these jatis who are much more closer to nature and who have their own forms of worship. And they try to draw this kind of a binary comparison between both. And what these researchers ignore, either deliberately or unknowingly, is all of the similar nature worship practices that are very, very strongly imbibed into Sanatan Dharma or Hindu Dharma. Now, these research papers on spiritual ecology, typically, they talk about how various cultures, particularly the forest cultures, they look at interrelatedness of various beings, and how you have an anthropocentric perspective of Western science, a particular flavor of epistemology that places humankind above all beings, including nature. And then they question this, that you have this model of Western science, and then you have this glorious nature-friendly model of the forest peoples, and they try to draw that kind of a binary. As I mentioned, across a lot of these researchers, you would see that consciously or unconsciously, Hindu Dharma is largely ignored, and or there's just a passing mention. Nobody really delves deep into these kind of concepts and implementation that are very integral to Sanatan Dharma universe. Again, very interestingly, a lot of these researchers also owe their allegiance to the Marxist or leftist ideology. But then if you look at how, let's say, the Soviet communist era, that's a good marker of how communism operated when in power. And if you look at what they did with nature, you'd find that it is not very different with what today a lot of environmentalists are accusing the Western model of. Essentially, you see nature as something that needs to be exploited, something that needs to be tamed. And it's the same trajectory that the Marxist ideologues also have taken when they were in power. So that's one aspect of today's discourse, where a lot of the environmentalist ecological discourse is rendered from a Marxist perspective, and Hindu Dharma is typically ignored. And the Western model or the Western capitalistic model, that is shown as a kind of a model that has flaws. And that's a flavor of research that happens. So essentially, they try to show that this is a developmental paradigm that is rooted in anthropocentrism. And they call for decolonization of Western epistemology and so on. And it is in here that, as I mentioned, they use this binary of indigenous or tribal cultures versus modern Western culture binary. And they deliberately portray as if nothing exists in between. There's a lot of ground that has been covered in this country over centuries. Vedic model, Sanatan Dharma, Hindu Dharma, it had some of these ecological, environmental fundamentals strongly ingrained into the day-to-day cultural consciousness, into its core text. The other aspect that is also interesting is the Hindu side today, even those who are, let's say, vocal in public forums about Hinduism, environmentalism is something that a lot of people generally are a bit distant from it, because they see it as something like a full stomach phenomenon, which is that let India first get rich, let us get as rich as, let's say, US, or at least as rich as, let's say, China, and then we can worry about environment. Some, in fact, also talk about what economists call as environmental consciousness curve, which is that it's like a curve, an inverted U-shaped curve, where in the initial phases of development, your environmental pollution and ecological balance, all of that will get affected. And after a point, some kind of a decoupling happens, and then slowly, development continues to happen, and ecology and environment, all of it also continues to be great, because at some point, inversion that happens, where you can keep the development progress, that trajectory can keep going on, but there is no damage to the environment or ecology. That's one thinking that dominates some of our own thinking on the Hindu side. And there's a lot of scholarship where people contest that particular ideology, that you can decouple development and environmental concerns. And that's something that we need to be concerned about as Hindus, because it impacts not just us, but also our coming generations. Ecological consciousness is very, very central to Dharma. And through this talk today, we'll be trying to give an overview of the centrality of rivers, particularly in the ecological consciousness, and rivers on the Hindu psyche. Primarily, when we talk about rivers, we are going to look at Ganga as a representative of how we have looked at rivers through this civilization, through this culture. There's one particular aspect of legal activism, which is also important for this particular discussion today. Now, in about 5 years ago, 2017, there was a particular decision of the Uttarakhand High Court, which caught attention of a lot of people. So the High Court made this decision based on some similar judgments that have been made in countries like New Zealand and other such places, where rivers were looked at as entities which have some kind of jurisdictional value. So they were looked at as entities which have some kind of a personhood, some kind of rights. So this is something that caught the attention of a lot of people, because traditionally we've all been in this developmental paradigm that came from the West. We never looked at rivers as personalities or rivers as entities that have their own rights. And we continue to exploit rivers as if they are inert beings. And there has been some activism across the world, particularly again driven by indigenous or forest people or tribal people in various parts of the world, where they argue that as per their faith, the river is not an inert entity and it's a sentient being. And some of them have gone to the courts and have won some kind of judgments in other countries where river has got some kind of personhood. Now, Uttarakhand High Court had put in judgment where they had given personhood for Ganga and Yamuna, and then later it went to the Supreme Court, and then Supreme Court overruled, citing various legal complications around moving forward on that particular aspect. Now, in here again, what is interesting is that a lot of researchers looked at this particular judgment, and they some of them got worried, and they started accusing these activities as what is called Hindutva light, which is essentially saying that by saying Ganga is important for us as a religion, as a custom, you are essentially trying to inject Hindutva into law, Hindutva into the legal discourse. And they accuse a lot of these people of trying to perpetrate what they call as Hindutva light. And they say that this is a form of Hindu fundamentalism, so on. So this current is important because, as I mentioned early on in the talk, today environmentalism is seen as a leftist bastion. And any attempt to try to bring in the cultural and the civilizational consciousness into the environmentalist discourse is seen as a threat by them. And anybody who tries to attempt this, let's say from a Hindu standpoint, they get accused of Hindutva fundamentalism, Hindutva light. The court acknowledged that the way we are treating the rivers today as a part of our own developmental paradigm is not correct. And they try to make the river a juristic person, so that at some point in time, you can talk about the rights of the rivers and, let's say, reject attempts to do indiscriminate development on the rivers. Now, as I mentioned, there are several countries where this kind of a discussion has happened. And overall, in general, I think rivers are integral to civilizations. So in our case, Ganga is something that we as Hindus venerate, Ganga Ma as a divine form. The imagery that of Ganga in contemporary times, I'd refer to probably three things. One is, of course, all the activism or all the initiatives that various governments in various capacities have been doing, like the Namami Ganga initiative that the BJP government pioneered. There was a Ganga action plan. There was a national mission for clean Ganga. Of course, not without criticism. There's a lot of activists who criticize that they're not doing enough, or they're taking it in a different direction. But that is one imagery where you have governments and you have political leaders who have come out in the open. And like the Namami Ganga initiative, where there are people who came out in the open and said that we acknowledge that Ganga is central to the Indian or Hindu consciousness, and we as governments, we are going to do something to make the river better. So that's one imagery. The second imagery is of somebody like Professor G.D. Agarwal or Swami Sanand, who sacrificed his life fighting for Aviral Ganga, Nirmal Ganga. And that's one strand of environmental activism that happened in the country, where there are these particular activists who said that you are not doing enough to protect the free-flowing nature of Ganga. And hence, you're also not doing enough to protect the Nirmalta of Ganga, which is the purity of Ganga. And because Ganga is central to the Hindu consciousness, there are people like Professor G.D. Agarwal who have sacrificed his life. This happened in about 2018. So these are two imageries. One is government action and one is the activist effort. The third imagery, I think, is something more recent as well, and something that is very, very popular. A lot of people remember this, which is that when the Chhat Puja happened in Delhi, in the Yamuna River, this happened once in 2021 and then also in 2019. You could see a lot of women who were worshipping the sun god, despite all the toxic foam in the Yamuna River. So there were a lot of pictures that went all around social media and print media, where you have these huge white foams enveloping the rivers and people worshipping the sun god despite all those white foams. And I think that image is something that is important for this talk today, because that captures the dilemma of our times, where on one end, we are venerating rivers. On one end, we are saying that river worship and worship of other deities through rivers, that is central to the Hindu consciousness. And on another end, we are letting all of this toxic foams and pollution, all of this happen to our rivers. In fact, I think it was in 2021 where, given that this festival was occurring, there were vehicles that were deployed, people that were deployed, so that for that brief period, the foam was removed from the river in some parts of places where this worship was done. So these are very strange dilemmas of our times, where we are doing a lot of unplanned urbanization, unplanned industrialization. Everything is happening in a rush without thinking about the consequences, particularly the consequences on our ecosystems, on ecology, on rivers. And there is no better description or no better imagery of our contemporary challenges than that image of people doing the Chhat Puja amidst that white toxic foam on the river Yamuna. So in this talk today, what we are trying to do is that we are trying to understand how Sanatana Dharma, we looked at rivers in our own consciousness, and how that at times is running into contradiction with some of our own developmental paradigms. Several dharmic thinkers of our times who are now lamenting the fact that as a country, we've had many, many years of colonization, first by the invaders, let's say the Islamists, and then in recent past, the last 200 years before independence with the English. And there are these dharmic thinkers who say that even through these several years of colonization, our rivers were never in such a bad shape as they are today, where after 75 years or 7 decades of rule of our own people, we have let our rivers go so bad that we are now in a shape where perhaps there are people who are saying that when the colonizers were here, our rivers were in a better shape. And that is again happening because we have blindly adopted a particular developmental paradigm, not understanding the costs or the pace or the nuances of what happens when you just copy paste a model from elsewhere and then put it back here. And there's a lot of thinking that has happened in the past few decades from our own dharma gurus and our own traditional scholars on this particular aspect. Now, a lot of these scholars also question, for good reasons, the proliferation of several hydroelectric projects, where we started with 1, 2, and then it moved to tens and then to hundreds. And there are now people questioning on whether there should be some kind of a balance there. Perhaps some geographies should be treated as eco-sensitive zones, and maybe you shouldn't touch those zones. Now, all of this is, of course, contested, because there are some, as I mentioned at the early parts of the talk, who see this as anti-development rhetoric, and they see the whole environmentalism as some kind of a leftist conspiracy, or as something that only rich countries should worry about. And since we are not rich enough, we should just go about it as if there is no tomorrow. So this is something that is contested by several people who owe their allegiance to Hindu Dharma and Sanatana Dharma. These are strong traditional Dharma gurus, sannyasis and thinkers who consider themselves as deeply devout and religious people. And they are saying that this is perhaps not something that is in line with Hinduism or Hindu Dharma. And it's about time that we pay attention to that particular thinking. So it is not just hydroelectric projects There are several aspects to this because it's a very connected ecosystem. So there are questions on indiscriminate sand mining, illegal sand mining, and there are questions on balancing the various needs that come from the construction industry, industrial needs, and of course the drivers for growth, development, and jobs, so on. Now, what is the result of this, based on what several traditional thinkers say, is that as tradition, we look at everything in three planes or three perspectives. One is what is called the Adi Bhautik. There is another which is called the Adi Daivik, and another which is called the Adhyatmik. So Adi Bhautik, to reduce it to something that people can understand in plain English, is what we see and what typically what the rationalist or the scientific outlook kind of looks at, which is a real world or what is seen. And the Adi Daivik is the world, let's say, of the Devas, where the human form interacts with the Devas, the divine forms. And Adhyatmik is the spiritual plane of what happens between the Atma and you. So that is the three planes. So you have Adi Daivik, Adhyatmik, and Adi Bhautik. Now, what is happening here is our developmental paradigm or model, because it came from a Western scientific outlook, it doesn't really respect the Adi Daivik and Adhyatmik perspectives on matters like this. And even on the Adi Bhautik plane, what we are doing, as I mentioned, is a lot of indiscriminate or fast-paced development. And what is the result is that you are in a situation where you are neglecting the Adi Daivik and Adhyatmik planes, and your Adi Bhautik plane is also destroyed. So that's the contradiction of our times. And it is here that it is probably time for us as Hindus to relook at how our own culture looked at rivers and try to see if there is a better model of development that can evolve, where the Adhyatmik, Adi Daivik, and Adi Bhautik, all three planes get to play their role. So here, let's spend some time looking into how Hinduism as a tradition, as a culture, looked at rivers. And as an example, or as a replica of how across the board we look at rivers, we'll take Hinduism's venerations for the river Ganga, and let's see of how that particular veneration penetrated through the consciousness of Hindus over time, and then try and understand what we can do with that consciousness in light of everything that is happening today with our rivers. Now, if you look at river Ganga, right from, let's say, the sources like Rig Veda, Atharva Veda, and then Gita, Bharat, Bhagavad Puran, Agni Puran, they're just numerous. There's a very popular verse that is used in some of the Ganga bhajans, which goes something like this. So it says, Gangaiva Paramo Bandhu, Gangaiva Paramam Sukham, Gangaiva Paramam Vittam, Gangaiva Parama Gatihi, Gangaiva Parama Muktim, gaṅgāṣṭakam. What this means is that you look at Ganga as Param Bandhu, which is Bandhu is something that everybody understands, which is that like it's some sort of a kinship or a relation. So it's like a highest form of a relation that you have, kinship that you have with the river. And then Ganga is seen as Param Sukh, which is Sukh again. It's not easy to translate that into English, but you can look at it as the highest form of happiness. And Ganga is also looked at as Paramam Vittam. Vittam is dhan or wealth, which is, you see that river waters and everything that goes about with the rivers, you see that as the highest form of wealth. And then you also see Ganga as Paramagati, which is the end state or the moksha, kind of a place where you get moksha. So that's one form of veneration. And you also see it as a place where you get mukti. And then you also see the river or Ganga as Param Tattva, which is the place where you can discover the highest insights of your own philosophy. So this is a way in which we have looked at Ganga as a river. And as I mentioned, it is also not just about the Adi Bhautik plane where you just go to a place and you see streams of water flowing. There's a lot more that happens in the Hindu psyche when you look at river like Ganga. So it is looked at as a river body, which is not just something that is related to what is happening here and now. And there is a divine spirit behind it. And that is where all of the consciousness we have around Ganga Ma comes in as a religion for us. So Ganga is looked at as Trilokya-pāvanī, which is not a river which is concerned just about this loka, which is the plane that we are operating on. It is also about the two other lokas, which are a part of the three loka that is popular in the Hindu consciousness. Now, of course, one can say there are rivers longer than this. So there are people who in fact say that why is it that Ganga is venerated so much? Let's say there is the Nile River, there is the Amazon, there is Mississippi. There are so many other rivers. What is so special about this river that Hindus are treating it as so sacred? And that's where a lot of cultural nuances come in. Because what is sacred for a particular religion, a particular people, it is something that only they understand from their own upbringing, from their own memories, and from their own consciousness. And it is not something that is as easily portable from one place to another. And it is here that if you are looking for a developmental paradigm that is rooted in your own consciousness, in your own culture, then that developmental paradigm should also respect your beliefs and your own feelings for your rivers. Ganga in Hindu consciousness, we look at Ganga as Jivan Datri, Annadatri, and Matru-swarupa, which is a river that is a life form of its own. It is a giver of life. It is a sustainer of life. And we also look at that river as a Matru-swarupa. So people look at the river as a mother goddess. And there's a lot of worship rituals and traditions that are associated with Ganga. And it's not just Ganga. So through this talk, when we say it is Ganga, it needs to be looked at as not something that is specific to that particular river there. It is actually something that transposes to various rivers across the country, because there are rivers, let's say down south, which are called Dakshin Ganga. And there are rivers elsewhere where again the suffix of Ganga is added, because Ganga is something which is seen as like an all-pervading consciousness in the way we look at rivers all through the country. So if you look at something like what is called the Nadi Stuti Sukta in Rig Veda, there's a long list of rivers that are mentioned there. And a lot of scholarship has already happened here, mentioning on how river worship and considering rivers as sacred is something that pervades across various Vedas. So Ganga has a lot of imagery associated, where you have Ganga being depicted as a Makaravahini, which is having a crocodile as the Vahana or the vehicle. And you have various saints and seers who have written a lot of works or sung a lot of hymns venerating Ganga. For example, there is something called the gaṅgāṣṭakam, penned by Adi Shankaracharya, which is very, very popular and used in various ritual forms during festivals and otherwise, venerating Ganga. So in this particular gaṅgāṣṭakam by Shankaracharya, there's a particular line which is important for this discussion today. So Ganga is referred to here as Brahmāṇḍaṃ khaṇḍayantī, haraśirasi, and jaṭāvallimullāsayantī. So what it means is Brahmāṇḍaṃ khaṇḍayantī is that it is water body that is originating from breaking the universe into two, and haraśirasi and jaṭāvallimullāsayantī, which is it is a water that is coming from the Jata of Shiva, which is the hair curls on Lord Shiva's head. So this way, Ganga is something that has pervaded all through Hindu consciousness, where it is seen as a divine river that is originating from our own gods. There is also another version of this gaṅgāṣṭakam, which is penned by the sage Valmiki. And this is again something that is chanted by many as part of their puja rituals. Many do it daily as well. And in here, in this particular gaṅgāṣṭakam, one can also see that there is something written here which says that if you chant this particular shloka diligently, religiously as a part of your rituals, this is something that can cleanse you of all the dirt and sins of Kali, which is it's called the Kali Kalmasha Nashini, which is essentially that all the sins that you are accumulating in the Kali Yuga, you are going to cleanse yourself of those sins because of chanting and venerating river Ganga. So this is how we are looking at the river as something that is very, very integral to the Hindu consciousness. So right from Valmiki's gaṅgāṣṭakam to Shankaracharya's gaṅgāṣṭakam to what you see in Vedas, what you see in Puranas, what you see in Mahabharata, this is something that is pervading across all our epics. So it is very tragic when you see a lot of this scholarship that happens talking about spiritual ecology and then ignoring the entire Hindu dharmic discourse, where rivers are considered integral to the Hindu dharmic practice. And they just talk about it in a passing mention, because nobody wants to give credit to Hindu dharmic ecosystem for doing something that, let's say, they are now trying to say something like a new or an innovation in the ecology discourse. Again, in the Hindu discourse, what is interesting is also that it's not just about what happens, let's say, in the ritual space on the Puranas, Gita, and Bhagavatam, so on. There's also an Ayurvedic discourse that happens in the Hindu consciousness. You have, let's say, works like the Charaka Samhita and other such long lineage of works that have happened over the years. And even there, one would see a lot of mention of the water, the Ganga Jal, of the various qualities of the Ganga Jal and how that has its own medicinal properties. And these are beliefs that are continuing to this day across the country, even though there's a lot of urbanization, westernization, and whatever that is happening all around in the name of development. This is not something that we have lost, unlike, let's say, several other civilizations. This is something that continues to pervade through our day-to-day. So you have, let's say, the idea of Ganga Jal, which still continues to operate as something as very, very important in several rituals. You also have the idea of Ganga Yatra. You have the idea of Ganga Darshan. And this Ganga Darshan also, there's a twofold part to it, where it is not just about you seeing it, it's also about you taking others along with you and then helping them have the darshan. So you have various lines written in our own Shastras and Puranas of the whole, let's say, the rule book of sorts to be followed when this kind of darshan happens. There is also very specific lines and shlokas, even in books like the Dharma Shastras, where you have elaborate lines written which say that this is the process you need to follow when you are getting into the river. This is the process you have to follow when you are getting out of the river. This is how you need to touch the waters, and this is how you should stay on the shores of Ganga. These activities are prohibited when you are in the river. These activities are prohibited the day before, the day after, so on. So there's a lot of elaborate ritual ecosystem that has evolved over the years on how we need to interact with rivers and how we need to conduct ourselves when we do rituals with the rivers. You also have this whole ideal of Shraddh and Tarpan, and which is essentially all the ancestral rites that Hindus perform, devout Hindus perform. All of this, rivers again play a very, very important role. And a lot of pilgrimages to this day happen around this particular activity, the Tarpan or Shraddh, the activity that happens. Ganga Jal and Ganga Tat, or the banks of Ganga, are very, very important there. Now, of course, there's a lot of imagery around Kashi and then death rites that happen near Kashi. And again, even there, the river Ganga plays a role. So you see that as a river, it's something that plays a role throughout the Hindu consciousness, right from birth to death, and then the cycle repeats. So the ideas of giving tarpan in Ganga and Devata tarpan, Pitru tarpan, and all of these things are very, very integral to the Hindu consciousness. So it is not something that, let's say, river worship or river rituals are something that are that belong to a particular class of forest tribes, mul nivasi-s, so on. It is something that is part of the consciousness of people all across the country. So it's not something that is just confined to some particular pockets of the country, as it is made out by some researchers today. So Ganga plays a very important role in various activities like Dan, which is donations, ritual donations, sacred donations, obligations, dhyan, which is meditation, jap, again, forms of devotion, worship, meditations, homam or yajnam, pujas that happen. Again, there's a lot of importance for rituals or yajnas that are conducted on the banks of the rivers. Every single place of pilgrim or ritual importance, the tirthas that we have all across the country, all of these are very intimately connected with water bodies and river bodies. So all places that people go to as a part of their annual pilgrimages, as a part of their ritual pilgrimages, all of them will have a ritual where they have to go to a particular water body, indulge in a particular ritual, be it tarpan, be it ritual snan or a bath. And all of these are intimately connected to local legends or larger legends in Puranas, in epics, so on. So this is something that one can see, let's say, right at the bottom of the country geographically, from the Kanyakumaris and Rameshwarams, and as you start moving up to every single tirthal that are associated with several states all across the country, you'd see this, that there is a river or a water body that is associated with that place, and then there is typically a temple on the river bank, and there is worship that happens there, and there are festivals or melas that happen in that particular place with that particular river. So this kind of tirth or a circuit that one can see with Kumbh Melas, with temples, and with a lot of our places of great ritual importance. You can see this with, or let's say, all of the darshans that happen around Badrinath, around Kedarnath, around all the Chardham yatras that happen. There's a lot of such yatras that happen, called like the Ganga yatra that happens. There is a lot of rituals that happen in places like Jagannath Puri. There is rituals that happen in places all through the western coast. There are so many places through the country where you have temples in riverbanks, temples in seashores, and temples around sacred water bodies. And there are temples of riverine bodies as well, in the place where a particular river is said to have originated, like the Gangotris. Gangotri, for example, you have a lot of sacred ecosystem that builds around that particular Tirthasthal. So that is how important rivers are for Hindus, for their own rituals and for their own festivals and for their own pilgrimages. Now, if you look at the origin stories of the rivers, again, this is something that plays out across civilizations, where a lot of older, let's say, river civilizations, you can look at the lore that you see around rivers in Africa. You can see this in places like South America or New Zealand and several other places as well, where rivers are integral to civilizations. And if you look at our own origin stories on Ganga, there are stories that are very, very integral part of our own epics. Like Ramayana, for example, has the story of Bhagirath, Sagara Kumaras, where the whole penance that Bhagirath conducted so that Ganga comes back to the earth, and then from the sacred waters of Ganga, the Sagara Putras, who are the 60,000 sons of the king Sagara, they attain Swarga or Moksha once the sacred waters of Ganga touch them. So that's a very, very famous imagery that a lot of people have. In fact, even today we have festivals conducted as a ritual remembrance around that particular Ganga Avataran, which is when Ganga came to the earth. And Ganga is also, there is another backstory or a continuation of this particular story, where Ganga is also seen as Vishnu Charanodak, which means Ganga as a river has originated from the foot of Vishnu. And this is a story that one can see in around Vamana Avatar, where that's one of the avatars of Vishnu. And in the story around the Vamana Avatar, one can again see the connection of the origin of river Ganga coming from the foot of Vishnu, and hence Ganga is also called Vishnu Charanodak. And as I mentioned early on with the reference for Shankaracharya's gaṅgāṣṭakam, that imagery of Ganga coming from Shiva's Jata Juta, and Ganga and Shiva have a very integral pairing, which is something that a lot of devotees of Hinduism are quite familiar with. And if you take something like Mahabharata, for example, you also have one of the very initial parts of Mahabharata where the whole story really starts with Ganga, because you have Ganga being venerated there as the Janani of Bhishma, the mother of Bhishma. And the whole story around how Bhishma came to be and how Mahabharata and the whole dynasties came to be, they're all very tightly connected to Ganga. Sita in Ramayana, Sita is known to have prayed to Ganga in multiple instances, and you have verses from Valmiki Ramayana which show Sita worshipping Ganga. And as I mentioned, there's a whole Tirtha Kshetras and pilgrim circuits that are associated with Ganga. Again, this is something that several scholars have also cited, which is that even the Muslim rulers or invaders who settled down in the country over the years, even they actually ended up using Ganga Jal in their own rituals and routines. Of course, this is not an attempt to, let's say, talk about famous or infamous Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb. It is only to say that even somebody who doesn't belong to the Hindu faith could not help fall under the spell of the riverine worship or the centrality of Ganga to the Hindu consciousness. So even if you have, let's say, stories of Mughal emperors using Ganga Jal for spiritual ritual purposes, it needs to be seen as the impact of Ganga or the centrality of Ganga to the Hindu consciousness that even they couldn't avoid it. Let's say in the modern times, if you look at, let's say, even somebody like Jawaharlal Nehru, who despite all of his, let's say, secular liberalism or some flavor of scientific rationalistic atheism, so on, even he couldn't avoid finally attaching himself with Ganga, where his will is quite popular, where he mentioned that he wants a part of his ashes to be submerged in the sacred Ganga. And of course, he put some qualifier saying that this is not because of religious significance, but it is because of cultural significance, so on. So whatever that is, it is that any Hindu who has been brought up on this land, he cannot escape the fact that Ganga or rivers or river worship is something that is central to the Hindu consciousness. So even though you might be attempting to have a break from fast, it is not easy to, let's say, wash yourself of the importance of rivers to the Hindu psyche. And if you look at, let's say, all of the rituals and festivals that are a part of the Hindu religion, you would see that there are very specific rituals that are a part of the Ganga river. There is something called the Gaṅgāṣṭakam, which is celebrated in multiple pockets of the country. And of course, let's say something like Kumbh Mela is something that is very, very popular and doesn't need any introduction. And there are various forms of pushkaras that also happen once in 12 years with several rivers all through the country. And in all of these instances, you can see the same tenets of riverine worship that are central to the Hindu consciousness. It can be the sacred baths that people perform. It can be, as I mentioned, the tarpans or ancestral rites. It can be rituals. It can be the namaskars that people do, or it can just be that that one bottle of Ganga Jal that people carry back home. So it is something that pervades the Hindu practice all across. In fact, there is this one paragraph from the Kashi Khand of the Skand Puran, which is very interesting in light of the early part of the discussion, where there is this conversation between the gods, where it is told that only somebody who is a Nastika or somebody who, let's say, is an atheist, somebody who is a perennial skeptic or a doubtful person, it is only such people who can look at Ganga as just another river. So this is what the Skand Puran says, that only somebody who is totally devoid of this kind of a religious metaphysic or spiritual understanding, it is only such people who can just look at it and then say, oh, it's just a river or it's just water flowing from here to there. So it's very important because how you look at the river and how you venerate it matters when you get into a lot of these development ecology debates on how much is too much. So there is a line in a bhajan, in a Ganga bhajan, also part of an old Hindu movie, which is relevant for this conversation here. So that line goes, Mano to me Ganga mahu, na mane to behta pani, which is that if you look at me as mother goddess, then I am Ganga ma for you. If you don't look at me that way, then I am just behta pani, which is I'm just flowing water. So that kind of shows the probably two different models of developmental paradigms, of one where we look at Ganga as Ganga Ma, and another where we look at Ganga as just Behta Pani, which is, let's say, the way in which we have been looking at our rivers for the past 7.5 decades. And perhaps it is time now to understand if there is there a different model of development that we need to explore in light of everything that is happening to our rivers. So if you look at a lot of the documentation that has emerged in the past few years on rivers, let's say all of the documentation that came out from the missions like the Namami Gange mission and a lot of environmental activism, you'd see that our rivers today are submerged with a lot of sewage waste, factory waste, plastic waste, and the plaster of Paris, and so on. And not to also mention the stress on the rivers because of all of the projects and hydroelectric demand, so on. So it's about time that we kind of look at these in terms of, is there like a Hindu perspective on development that can emerge? And is that something that can show us a way in terms of building a more sustainable developmental paradigm? So Ganga, as I mentioned, it operates in, or we look at Ganga in three different planes, which is the Adi-Daivik, Adi-Bhautik, and Adhyatmik. And perhaps even our developmental model needs to evolve so that we also look at it in terms of not just development here and now, let's say in this quarter or the next quarter, something more long-term and something that is also not just limiting itself to the material plane and something that is open to looking at Adi-Daivik and Adhyatmik planes. So what happens to Ganga, people say, is an indicator of what would happen to all other rivers and all other water bodies and what will happen to us as a civilization. So it is in that context that all of this discourse is important. So what I refer to today here, a lot of it is from this very good book called Ganga by the Gita Press, published in 2016. And I'd like to end this talk today by referencing a particular passage there in that book from the Shankaracharyas of the Amna Epitams. So in that book, you have the Shankaracharyas from Sringeri, Dwarka, and Puri speak on the state of Ganga and on what are the next steps or the way forward for us as a people. This is something that our own Shankaracharyas are saying, which is that as a people, we are habituated to looking at our rivers as harbingers or repositories of dharma and moksha. And as we venerate them as repositories or harbingers of dharma and moksha. As a benefit, we also get, they also satisfy our artha and kama. So the artha and kama are byproducts where dharma and moksha is the focus. Now, what we have done over the years is that we've started looking at them purely as a source of artha and kama, and we have considered the artha and kama part of it as the maulik sparup, or a basic form of the rivers. And that is one reason why rivers are getting destroyed over the years, our traditional dharma gurus say. So what they say is that start looking at your rivers again as repositories of dharma and moksha. Start looking at yourself from these planes of Adidaivik and Adhyatmik, and not just the Adibodhik plane. And it is only then that we'll perhaps be able to evolve on a model of vikas or development, which is not something that runs contrary to what is called Vedic Sanatan Dharmic Vyavastha. So you have a model of development which is running today, which is largely dominated by a scientific rationalism. And you have another whole developmental paradigm that can perhaps evolve when you start looking at your rivers as repositories of dharma and moksha, and not just artha and kama. So I'd like to end this particular talk by draw attention to this fact, which I alluded to at the beginning, which is that we need to resist these attempts, ignore or shun these perspectives as Hindutva or Hindutva light or whatever people want to call it. And also not say that let's not worry about environment and ecology only after we get rich. So these are two strands that are happening, where the ecological or environmentalist discourse is ignoring Hinduism, saying that you are trying to put Hindu majoritarianism or Hindutva into the discourse. So we need to look at ecological consciousness as something that is as an integral part of Sanatan Dharma. And we need to look at the whole development discourse that is happening from a dharmic lens, and not from a Marxist lens, or let's say from a Western epistemological lens. And we should start looking at it from our own lens. And as a civilization, we have a responsibility towards protecting our own rivers, and be it with collaborating with, let's say, the initiatives by the state governments, or questioning the developmental paradigms, or contributing in any other ways. We as Hindus need to stay connected to this whole ecological discourse and not abandon it, so that it is just left as some kind of a passing remark or some kind of footnote, as we continue to blindly adopt a developmental paradigm which is clearly not prepared to address the challenges of environment and ecology and sustainable development. Thank you for the Atharva Forum for giving me this opportunity.